Okay. In the last pod, we started talking about what the important elements are which make up a cue or a stimulus, which start the pattern of a habit. Today, we want to talk start a little bit about what exactly happens with that cue, and how exactly a habit starts to form. Okay, so we spoke about a few weeks ago, the concept of building up the connections between neurons, and now we want to talk a little bit about how that happens, or how we start to build a cue and how a cue starts to develop. The most obvious way, and the most natural way, and the most basic way is repetition. Okay, what we mentioned as the phrase of neurons which fire together, wire together. Repetition, the more you repeat, the more a person does one action and then another action, one action, then another action, one action, then another action. And you do it over and over and over, so that starts to hardwire. Then those neurons start to do that automatically. Okay, we know that when it's physically, so it's almost like a reflex. Okay, but when it's a feeling, we can talk about almost like reflexive automatic feeling or reflexive automatic thought. That automatically, and in general, that the point of the automatic part of the habit is that you can complete the sentence of whenever X, then Y. Whenever there's a certain situation, whenever there's a certain scenario, whenever there's a certain phenomenon, then something happens naturally, and that without even being aware of it. Okay? That's the most obvious way. Okay? Repetition. Lots and lots and lots of repetition becomes automatic. That's the most obvious, okay? And that if you're doing something in sports, then you get trained. If you repeat an action over and over and over and over, it becomes not just second nature, but you're not even necessarily aware of the fact that that's what you're doing. Whether you have a certain type of motion which then flows one after another, or a certain type of situation that you automatically, reflexively react in a certain way. Okay, so the most natural way is that you repeat it, and you repeat it, and you repeat it. Okay, something we're not going to talk about now is sometimes there are certain situations which we know don't necessarily take a long time and a lot of repetition to create a certain connection, but you can have something which is traumatic, which can create a connection very quickly. Okay, that you have something once which happens very traumatically, and it happens in such a way that those neurons get binded, and in a almost an automatic way. So it creates an automatic fear, an instantaneous fear, whenever that certain scenario or situation comes up again, even though it hasn't been repeated lots of times. Okay, what I want to talk about today is something which we call observational conditioning. Okay, which on the one hand might seem very intuitive to us, but when we get to the science of it, it's actually a tremendous chiddush which has tremendous repercussions. Okay, the concept of observational conditioning is that not only from doing things one after another do we hardwire our brain that it starts to happen automatically, but sometimes just by watching. Okay? By watching something happen, whenever I see a certain scenario, then I see what comes after that. And I see what comes after that, that also affects my mind, even though I never did it. Okay? It's the basis of what we assume when we talk about mentoring, or when we talk about modeling, we talk about role modeling. When I see something, if I see it enough times, even if I've never done it, it can become automatic to me. Okay? Now this has tremendous application to Kumuvan Lara, and to Kumuvan Latov, for good and for bad. Now, let me just point out what we're saying, okay? It's obviously intuitive and makes sense that I learn from that which is around. That when I watch something, so I'm going to learn to do the same. What's not intuitive to us is that when I see something, even if I don't think it, even if I don't believe it, it still can become automatic to me. Okay, we'll take the most obvious scenario, or again, it's a difficult scenario, which also has probably come up in VAD or in class, okay, which is the concept of abuse. Okay, someone who has watched a cycle of abuse, who's watched a situation that whenever a certain scenario happens, abuse follows it. So even if they swear off and they say, I'm never gonna abuse, and it's the most terrible thing in the world, then even though there are surveys which are done, which we see that on a mental level, on a thought level, they are more turned off, almost in an obsessive way. They're turned off from abuse, but still, in extraordinary percentages, they themselves automatically respond with abuse. Meaning you can develop a habit of the way you respond automatically, even to something which you mentally or cognitively hate, do not want to do, are committed against. Okay? And it's not just in terms of just a pattern of action. There can be a situation of a pattern of thought. You can be in a situation of where you yourself watch a certain type of prejudice, a certain type of bias towards something. Certain type, let's say you grow up in a culture where people are very disdainful about something and make fun of something and joke about something and are disparaging about something, and you in your mind totally disagree with that, and you think it's not true, and you think that that's terrible. But sometimes you can not even necessarily find yourself, but we can see sometimes there's an automatic bias. You find yourself in that situation and you'll react with a certain negativity towards it or a certain hesitancy towards it. Okay? That's something which is scary. Okay? It means that there's something even, okay, and obviously this has tremendous implication on, let's say, hashkafa, on the responsibility for us to be very aware and thoughtful and mindful hashkafically, because our surrounding can easily establish a certain bias. Okay, we've pointed out before some of the challenge sometimes in, let's say, when we watch certain scenarios, when we watch, let's say, things on the screen, on movies, or we watch something in terms of television shows, and we know that it's make-believe, and we know it's ridiculous, and even the topic, or even it could be that the family which is there, the family setting there, is comically nonsensical, and we know that it's something which is ridiculous. But nonetheless, if we watch it, there are certain patterns which we can develop of responding in the same way that we saw someone else respond, even though we know that it's ridiculous, and even though we've never done it before. So the concept here we have is that this is really something which, while in a certain level of learning from what's around us, that's normal. Okay? But to think that automatically our mind can start to get hardwired in ways which we've never done and which we don't believe or we think against. Okay? This is part of the challenge, and this is why there's an isser of shmias lashon hara, not just amiras lashon hara. Okay? And they're saying I'm not makabel is not enough. Sometimes, and this there's also been studies of, where sometimes when I watch someone, when I hear someone relate to something in a certain way, and certainly when it's repeated over and over, or there's a story which has been told about someone over and over and over, even though in my mind I don't believe it, okay? Someone can even sit there and say the story which I just told you was a lie. Or even more so, the story I'm about to tell you is a lie, and then they tell you that story, okay? Sometimes, even though in our mind we know it's not true, but when we see a relationship, when there's been a certain negativity which has been connected to that person, even though we know it's not true, there's a certain automatic bias which can develop there, okay? This doesn't mean that we don't have control to overcome it. That's what this avoda is going to be about, okay? But this certainly points to, number one, first of all, understanding how habits have developed and what some of the kelim are, which we're going to have over time, to see what kelim we have to reprogram or to take apart, to establish habits and to break apart. So this is one, okay? We spoke about doing, repeating. We speak about seeing, watching. Okay, this is why sometimes even playing something out and acting something out can be so effective. Okay, and then we're going to continue with another model in the next VAD, which will talk about another way that sometimes our neurons can get hardwired together, and we can react, think, feel, act automatically, even without having done it, and even without having seen it. Okay, so right now we're building up the kalim of how do we start to develop cues. I know that it sounds theoretical. That's part of doing a process of understanding what's going on. Okay, but it will, with time, become very lamaisa. Okay, but I always feel the more we understand, the better application we're going to have. It's like learning biyun. Okay, and we'll continue again. Hopefully, again, more further this week.